If you're enjoying these stories, you can support us on Patreon. There are several unique stories over there that I haven't uploaded to YouTube. Please consider supporting me on Patreon if you can. Now, let's get into the story. Chapter 1. The Query of the Crown Solicitor. The morning of late November was ushered in with a yellow, sulphurous fog that choked the throat and pressed its greasy saffron face against the panes of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. It was a day when London seemed buried in some subterranean tomb, the street lamps flickering like dying torches in a catacomb, and the muffled rumble of the hansom cabs below sounding distant and ghostly. The coal smoke from 10,000 hearths had mingled with the river damp, creating that dense carbonaceous vapour which the populace had come to call a London particular. It seeped through the cracks of our window frames, carrying with it the smell of soot and wet stone, and lay in thin, lazy wreaths across the ceiling of our chamber. Sherlock Holmes was in one of his dark, introspective moods. For 3 days he had paced the room, his thin, hawk-like profile silhouetted against the dull glow of the hearth, or sat huddled in his armchair with his chin sunk upon his breast, a victim to that terrible reaction which followed his periods of intense mental exertion. To a man of his singular constitution, the absence of a complex problem was a positive physical torment. His mind was like a racing engine, tearing itself to pieces when uncoupled from its work. He had spent the morning sorting and resorting his index ledgers, his fingers stained with the chemicals of some half-completed experiment, but his movements were mechanical and devoid of his usual sharp enthusiasm. The violin lay neglected in its case, and the corner of the room devoted to his chemical apparatus was a silent testament to his intellectual stagnation. "The world is commonplace, Watson," he said, staring into the yellow gloom of the street. "The criminal classes have lost all imagination. Look out of that window. London is enveloped in a shroud of coal smoke and moral mediocrity. The great intellects of our age are silent, and the petty rogues have not the wit to rise above the level of a police court brawl. I am driven by an insatiable hunger, Watson, an intellectual craving to bring absolute order and empirical truth to this chaotic fog-draped metropolis. Yet what does the city offer me? A stolen pocketbook, a missing clerk, a domestic squabble. It is a slow stagnation of the brain, and you know how I dread that above all things." "I have no doubt," I remarked, looking up from my medical journal and setting aside my pipe, "that some singular problem will soon present itself. The tide of human misery and intrigue must eventually wash a worthy vessel onto our shore. London is too vast and its secrets too dark for your talents to remain idle for long." "Let us hope so," Holmes muttered, his fingers drumming a restless tattoo upon his knee. "Otherwise I shall be forced to seek stimulation in those chemical agents which you so strongly deprecate. A brain like mine cannot remain inactive. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram or the most intricate analysis, and I am in my proper atmosphere. But this dead calm of the mind is more than I can bear." The sharp, demanding ring of our bell downstairs broke the silence of the room. A moment later we heard the heavy, measured tread of a man ascending our stairs. "A man of official weight," Holmes observed, his eyes instantly brightening, the listlessness vanishing from his frame like a discarded cloak. He stood up, his tall, lean figure suddenly tense with expectation. He walks with the deliberate heel-first stride of the civil servant. Yet there is a hurried unevenness in his pace, which speaks of a mind ill at ease. He has bypassed Mrs. Hudson's usual inquiries, so his business is urgent. She is showing him up now. The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson, with a look of mild surprise at the visitor's haste, ushered in Mr. Alistair Finch. The visitor was a small, dapper gentleman of some 50 years, clad in a heavy frock coat of impeccable dark broadcloth, though it was somewhat damp and beaded with the yellow moisture of the fog. In his gloved hand he carried a stout leather dispatch box bound with brass and bearing the royal monogram. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a species of scholarly anxiety, and his whiskers, greying at the temples, seemed to bristle with bureaucratic agitation. His boots, though of fine leather, were flecked with the grey mud of the Westminster embankment. "Mr. Holmes," he said, stepping into the room and offering a quick, nervous bow. "My name is Alistair Finch. I am the Crown Solicitor to the Treasury. I have come to you on a matter of the gravest national importance, a matter which touches upon the very foundations of our land laws and the rights of the Crown itself." "Pray take a seat, Mr. Finch," Holmes said, indicating the vacant armchair, "and allow me to relieve you of that heavy coat. The fire is small, but it is warm." Finch declined the offer with a wave of his hand, sinking into the chair and clutching his dispatch box to his breast as though it contained the crown jewels. He drew a fine linen handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his brow, which was beaded with perspiration despite the chill of the morning. "You are a busy man, Mr. Holmes," our visitor began, his voice trembling slightly, "and I shall not waste your time with administrative preambles. You see in me a man who is, quite frankly, at his wits' end. A crisis has arisen in the north, specifically in the West Riding of Yorkshire, which threatens to dispossess the Crown of tens of thousands of acres of valuable mineral and timber land, and to hand it over to a family whose ancient title is as decayed as their fortunes. You refer, no doubt, to the family of Baron Maudsley," Holmes remarked, leaning back in his chair, bringing his long, thin fingertips together and staring at the ceiling with his eyes half closed. Finch started, his eyes widening in utter astonishment. "Great heavens, Mr. Holmes, how could you possibly know that? The matter has been kept under the strictest seal of official secrecy. It has not been breathed to a single journalist, nor has it been discussed outside the private chambers of the Chancellor of the Exchequer." Holmes smiled his cold, thin-lipped smile, a flicker of amusement passing over his features. "It is my business to know what the public does not, Mr. Finch. Furthermore, the Maudsley family has for decades sought to assert their ancient feudal claims over the Yorkshire Commons. The newspapers have occasionally carried small notices of their failed petitions. When I see the Crown Solicitor carrying a treasury box, looking as though the earth were sliding beneath his feet, and when I recall that the present Baron Maudsley has recently returned from his self-imposed exile in Italy with a sudden renewed vigour in his litigation, the deduction is not particularly difficult. The Baron has found a lever, and he is prying at the gates of the Treasury." "Indeed, you are correct," Finch sighed, his shoulders sagging as he placed the heavy dispatch box on the table between us. "The Baron has long been a thorn in our side, but until now his claims were based on nothing more than vague family traditions, oral legends, and incomplete family trees. The courts have repeatedly dismissed his petitions for lack of documentary evidence. But 3 days ago everything changed. A document has been produced which, if valid, alters the legal landscape of this country. Ah? Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes gleaming with a sudden intense light. A document has appeared from the mists of the past? Tell me of its discovery. It was discovered, Finch explained, by a scholar named Victor Lynch, a man of considerable reputation in the field of paleography and manuscript restoration. He was employed by the Baron to catalogue the family archives in the deep, damp cellars of Maudsley Hall, a medieval pile that has stood in the Yorkshire Dales since the days of the Plantagenets. There, in an iron-bound chest that had lain forgotten beneath a collapsed portion of the masonry, Lynch claims to have found a missing Act of Parliament, the Act of 1584, passed in the 26th year of the reign of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Finch unlocked his dispatch box with a small brass key that hung from his watchguard. With great care he drew from the velvet-lined interior a long, heavy roll of parchment, wrapped in protective oil silk. "This act," Finch continued, his voice falling to a tense whisper, "explicitly grants the entire manor of Maudsley, including the vast forest lands, the water rights, and the rich mineral deposits of the surrounding valleys, to the Baron's ancestor Sir Hugo de Maudsley and his heirs in perpetuity. For 300 years the Crown has held these lands, believing them to have reverted to the state upon the attainder of a later Maudsley during the Civil War. But this document contains a specific clause protecting the family's tenure against any subsequent attainder. If this document is genuine, Mr. Holmes, the Crown must yield. The legal precedent is absolute. The loss to the public treasury will be immense, and a precedent will be set that could throw half the land tenure of England into chaos. The modern state cannot function if we are to be governed by the ghost of Tudor feudalism." "Let me see it," Holmes said, his voice quiet but commanding. Finch hesitated for a fraction of a second, then carefully unwrapped the oil silk and laid the parchment upon our central table, smoothing it out with his gloved hands. I leaned over Holmes's shoulder to inspect it. It was a magnificent piece of antiquity. The parchment was thick, heavy, and of a deep, uneven yellow-cream hue, showing the unmistakable signs of age. The slight curling of the edges, the microscopic cracks in the surface, and the natural yellowing that comes from centuries of exposure to air and dampness. The script was written in the elegant, sweeping court hand of the Elizabethan era. The ink faded to a rich dark brown, almost bronze in its undertones. At the foot of the document hung a massive seal of dark red wax, suspended by a braided silken cord of faded crimson and gold, bearing the royal signet of the Tudor rose. Holmes did not touch it immediately. He stood over it, his hands clasped behind his back, his nose bare inches from the surface. He was like a hound scenting its quarry, his eyes darting from letter to letter, analysing the slant of the strokes, the spacing of the words, the depth of the ink's penetration. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, "the beautiful unevenness of the margins." The scribe was no machine. He worked by the light of a tallow candle, his hand moving with the practised rhythm of the Elizabethan chancery. And look at the ink, the classic iron gall composition of the 16th century. It has eaten into the very fibres of the vellum, as is its nature over the course of 3 centuries. The acid in the oak galls has slowly bitten its way into the animal skin, creating that characteristic three-dimensional depth that no modern aniline dye can ever hope to replicate. He reached down, his long, sensitive fingers gently lifting the edge of the parchment to test its weight and texture. He brought his face closer, taking a deep, slow inhalation. "The scent of the iron gall is still present," Holmes murmured, his brow furrowing. A sharp metallic odour, like rusty nails in a damp cellar, mingled with the faint organic musk of old sheepskin. It is a scent that cannot be easily simulated. And yet... He paused, his eyes narrowing, as he stared at the heavy wax seal. He reached into his pocket and drew out his powerful pocket lens, focusing it upon the red wax of the Tudor rose. "And yet?" Finch asked, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes darting between Holmes's face and the document. "Is it not authentic, Mr. Holmes? Our own experts at the British Museum have examined the script and the parchment. They swear it is genuine. They say no modern hand could mimic the flow of the Elizabethan court hand with such flawless precision, nor could they artificialize the natural degradation of the iron gall ink. They declare it to be a legal miracle." "Your experts are men of books, Mr. Finch," Holmes said, standing up and looking down at the document with a cold, speculative gaze. "They look at the form, but they do not always see the substance. They see what they expect to see, a beautiful relic of the past. But I see a series of highly convenient coincidences. The provenance is remarkably convenient, is it not? A family on the brink of ruin, a scholar of Victor Lynch's reputation finding the one document that can save them, hidden in a cellar that has been searched a dozen times before. In my experience, when a lost document of such immense value appears precisely when it is most needed, one must look not at the hand that wrote it, but at the mind that conceived its discovery." "Then you believe it to be a forgery?" Finch cried, his face pale. "I believe nothing until I have tested it," Holmes replied, his voice hard, scientific, and utterly devoid of emotion. "The human intellect is capable of great deception, but the laws of nature do not lie. There is a tension here, Mr. Finch, between the ancient feudal nobility trying to reclaim its grasp on the modern world through the medium of this parchment, and the modern scientific method which must decide if their claim is built upon truth or upon falsehood. This document is a physical object, and as such it must obey the laws of physics and chemistry." He turned to me, his eyes shining with that cold, intellectual fire that I knew so well. "Watson, our morning is no longer commonplace. The yellow fog may cover London, but we have a microscopic world to explore. In the small compass of these fibres and this wax, we shall find the truth of this Elizabethan grandee." He looked back at the Crown Solicitor, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and awe. "Leave the document with me, Mr. Finch. I shall subject it to an inquisition such as no manuscript has ever faced before. If it is genuine, the Crown must pay its dues. If it is false, I shall tear the mask from Mr. Victor Lynch and his noble patron." Finch bowed deeply, his expression one of profound relief. "I leave it in your hands, Mr. Holmes. The treasury is at your disposal." With a final anxious glance at the parchment, the Crown Solicitor withdrew, leaving us alone in the quiet, fog-shrouded room with the ancient mystery of the Act of 1584. Chapter 2. The Microscopic Inquisition. The heavy oak door had scarcely closed behind the retreating figure of the Crown Solicitor, when the languor which had so heavily oppressed my friend was instantly dissipated. Sherlock Holmes sprang from his armchair with a sudden electric vitality, his grey eyes flashing with that fierce analytical light which always signalled the awakening of his formidable faculties. The listless philosopher of 5 minutes prior had vanished, replaced by the silent, relentless hunter of truth. "No time is to be lost, Watson," he cried, his voice ringing with a sharp metallic clarity. "The state of the weather may be abominable, but the atmosphere of this room is now charged with the most exquisite problem. A battle of intellects, Watson. On one side, the ancient feudal nobility seeking to reassert its dead hand over the living soil of Yorkshire by the aid of medieval parchment. On the other, the cold, impartial scrutiny of modern empirical science. Let us see which shall prevail." He carried the long roll of parchment to the small table in the corner of our sitting room, which was dedicated to his chemical investigations. It was a spot well known to me, and, I must confess, often dreaded, for its surface was scarred by the action of powerful acids, cluttered with glass retorts, test tubes and Bunsen burners, and stained with the dark residues of 100 bizarre experiments. The air of this corner was permanently touched with the pungent, sweetish odour of ether and the acrid tang of hydrochloric acid. With the utmost delicacy, Holmes spread the document flat upon the scarred pine wood, securing its curling edges with 2 heavy brass weights. He adjusted his double-lens microscope, bringing the instrument's brass barrel down until it was poised mere millimetres above the ancient-looking script. "We must proceed with absolute method, Watson," he murmured, his long, thin fingers adjusting the fine focus screw with the sensitivity of a pianist. "The human eye is an easily deceived organ, prone to seeing what the imagination desires, but the microscope does not lie. It reveals the minute physical reality of the world, and in those microscopic details we shall find either the signature of the 16th century or the clumsy hand of the 19th. For several minutes he remained bent over the eyepiece, so still that he might have been carved from marble. The only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic ticking of his pocket-watch and the dull, muffled rumble of the traffic in the fog-bound street below. "The skin is authentic, Watson," he said at last, rising and motioning for me to take his place at the lens. "Observe the surface. It is genuine sheepskin vellum, prepared in the old manner with lime and pumice. You can see the characteristic pattern of the hair follicles, flattened and distorted by the heavy wooden presses of the Tudor period. There are no modern wood pulp fibres, nor any trace of chemical bleaching. If this is a forgery, the operator has possessed himself of a blank sheet of ancient vellum. No difficult task for a man of Victor Lynch's archival connections. Many a blank fly-leaf has been torn from a 16th-century ledger for such a purpose." He turned to his chemical rack and selected a small, stoppered bottle of blue glass. "Now for the ink. The iron gall ink of our ancestors is a singular substance. It is not a mere dye that sits upon the surface. It is a chemical compound formed by the union of ferrous sulfate with the tannic acid derived from oak galls. Over centuries, this acid slowly bites into the collagen of the parchment, creating a deep, three-dimensional penetration that no modern aniline ink can replicate. With a steady hand, he dipped a fine glass capillary tube into the reagent, extracting an infinitesimal droplet of a highly dilute acid solution. He applied this droplet to the tail of a single letter, a capital E in the word Elizabeth, and watched the reaction through a powerful hand lens. "Ah," he muttered, a look of intense concentration settling upon his sharp features. The ink turns a faint, characteristic blue-black, and there is the unmistakable microscopic fracturing along the edges of the stroke where the acid has eaten into the skin. The iron gall composition is correct, Watson. The oxidation is uniform, and the depth of penetration matches precisely what we should expect from 300 years of slow chemical action. The scribe, whoever he was, used the exact chemical formula of the Elizabethan chancery. "Then the document is genuine?" I asked, a feeling of disappointment creeping over me. "The Crown must yield its lands?" "Slowly, Watson, slowly," Holmes cautioned, his finger raised in warning. "You fly to conclusions before all the data are assembled. We have tested the skin and we have tested the ink, and both have passed the initial scrutiny. But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and in this magnificent piece of ancient bureaucracy there is one component that has not yet been subjected to our inquisition." He pointed his long index finger at the heavy, dark red disc of wax that hung from the silken cord at the foot of the document. "The Great Seal of the Tudor Rose," Holmes whispered, his eyes narrowing. "A beautiful object, is it not? To the casual observer it is the very seal of majesty. But let us look closer. Let us look beneath the surface of this official red." He moved the microscope so that its field of view was positioned directly over the edge of the wax seal. He adjusted the light, reflecting the dull yellow glare of the foggy morning through the condenser mirror. "Come, Watson," he said, stepping aside. "Tell me what you see in the structure of the wax." I bent over the eyepiece, adjusting the focus until the red surface of the seal came into sharp relief. To the naked eye it had appeared dry, dusty and ancient, with the dull lustre of age. But under the powerful magnification of the lens, the surface presented a highly peculiar appearance. Instead of the smooth, amorphous structure of old settled beeswax, the red material was shot through with a network of tiny, needle-like crystals, glittering like hoarfrost in the morning sun. "It is crystallizing," I observed. "The wax seems to have a crystalline structure." "Precisely," Holmes cried, his voice sharp with triumph. "And that, Watson, is the one thing that Elizabethan beeswax should never do. The beeswax of 16th century England was a remarkably pure, organic substance, clarified by simple boiling in water and containing only the natural esters of the native European bee, Apis mellifera. It degrades over centuries by losing its volatile oils, becoming brittle and powdery, but it does not form these needle-like, acicular crystals." "Then what is this substance?" "This, Watson, is a wax that has been adulterated, or rather, it is a wax of an entirely different geographical origin. There are certain species of wild bees, native to the tropical regions of South America and the East Indies, whose wax contains a highly distinct proportion of free serotic acids and unique chemical impurities. When this wax is melted and allowed to cool slowly, it undergoes a process of microcrystallization that is entirely different from the European variety. The crystallization you see there is the physical signature of a modern import, a wax that was utterly unknown in the England of Queen Elizabeth." He paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bent forward in deep thought. "The forger was a master of his craft, Watson. He obtained the ancient parchment. He brewed the iron gall ink with the precision of an alchemist. He even obtained an authentic seal stamp to press the Tudor rose. But when it came to the wax, he was forced to purchase what was available in the modern market. He bought a fine, high-grade beeswax, believing it to be identical to the ancient product. He did not know, he could not know, that the microscopic world would betray him. "But how does this help us to find him?" I asked. "The wax might have come from any apothecary in London." "Not any apothecary, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes shining with the joy of the chase. "The import of these foreign waxes is a highly specialized trade. They are brought into this country in bulk, primarily for use in the manufacturing of fine polishes, anatomical models, and the restoration of ancient manuscripts. There is one man in London who is an acknowledged master of manuscript restoration, a man who has spent his life in the dusty archives of our great libraries, and who has recently been employed by Baron Maudslay." "Victor Lynch!" I exclaimed. "Exactly, Victor Lynch, whose laboratory and archives are situated near the London docks, where the merchantmen bring these exotic waxes from the ends of the earth. It is there that we must go if we are to find the source of this material. The docks are the great stomach of London, Watson, into which the commerce of the world is poured, and it is in those dark riverside warehouses that we shall find the thread that leads us to our clever forger." He snatched his silver pocket-watch from his fob, consulting it with a quick, decisive glance. "It is now 11:30. The fog is dense, but the hansom cabs are still running. We must visit the docks, Watson, and we must gain access to Lynch's archives under some plausible pretext. Let us put on our heaviest coats, for the river damp is treacherous, and plunge into this yellow wilderness." A few minutes later we were seated in the dark leather-lined interior of a hansom cab, our collars turned up against the freezing, sulphurous mist that rolled off the Thames. The horses' hooves clattered hollowly upon the wet cobblestones, and the dim, yellow glare of the street lamps loomed out of the fog like the eyes of giant, subterranean beasts. As we rattled eastward, leaving the polite squares of Marylebone behind, and plunging into the crowded, narrow streets of the city, I could not help but marvel at the extraordinary power of my companion's intellect. To him, the great chaotic city was not a confusion of random events, but a vast logical puzzle, where a microscopic crystal of wax in a quiet room in Baker Street could point the way to a dark conspiracy hidden beside the muddy waters of the Thames. Chapter 3. The Trap at the East End Laboratory. The journey eastward was a slow descent into a modern inferno. As our hansom crept past the boundaries of the city, the grand stone edifices of finance gave way to the low-browed, soot-begrimed tenements of Whitechapel and Shadwell. The yellow coal fog, which had been a mere nuisance in Baker Street, here became a suffocating, greasy mantle that clung to the skin and tasted of sulphur and coal tar. It was an atmosphere that seemed to breed moral rot, a heavy shroud concealing the desperate struggles of London's forgotten millions. Holmes sat in silence, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes fixed on some inward point of intense concentration. Only the occasional twitch of his thin nostrils or the tightening of his lips betrayed the furious activity of his brain. "The modern world, Watson," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the muffled rattle of the iron-shod wheels, "is governed not by the sword of the baron, but by the ledger of the merchant. Yet here, in these squalid streets, the two are strangely wedded. Mr. Victor Lynch, with all his paleographical learning, must still buy his materials from those who trade with the wild places of the earth. He cannot conjure Elizabethan wax from the air. He must purchase it from those who import it. The cab drew up with a sharp jerk at the corner of a narrow, ill-lit alley off the commercial road. The sign above the small, dingy shop front, barely legible through the grime and the fog, read, "Silas Crabbe, dry salter and importer of exotic gums." We stepped out into the freezing slush. The air was thick with the pungent, heavy odours of camphor, cardamom and decaying vegetable matter, the characteristic effluvium of the London docks. Holmes pushed open the door, causing a small tinny bell to clang sharply in the gloom of the interior. The shop was a labyrinth of shadows. Great gunny sacks of dried roots, casks of resin, and jars of strange dark oils crowded the floor, leaving only a narrow path to a counter of blackened oak. Behind it stood a small, withered man with a green shade over his eyes, who looked up at our entrance with the suspicious, defensive glance of the East End tradesman. "Good morning, Mr. Crabbe," Holmes said with easy familiarity, stepping up to the counter. "The weather is somewhat trying for a man of your years, no doubt. I trust the arrival of the Baltic ships has brought you some relief in the matter of your amber resins." The old man pushed up his green shade, squinting at my companion through the dim light of a single oil lamp. "I don't know you, sir," he said in a thin, raspy voice. "And as for the Baltic, there's little enough coming through the ice this month." "Quite so," Holmes replied, unchanged in his geniality. "I am a collector of old manuscripts, and I have been advised that you're the sole importer of those rare, unrefined waxes which are so essential for the preservation of ancient seals. In particular, I am looking for a consignment of that dark aromatic beeswax which is gathered by the wild bees of the South American forests, the Apis mellifera of the Orinoco basin." The dry salter's eyes narrowed, and he glanced nervously toward a heavy leather-bound ledger that lay open upon a desk behind him. "That is a very rare commodity, sir. I only import it in small quantities for the trade. It is not for the casual purchaser." "My needs are small, but my pocket is deep," Holmes said, producing a gold sovereign and placing it silently upon the counter. The gold gleamed with a warm, seductive light in the dingy shop. "And my friend here, Dr. Watson, can assure you that my interest is entirely scientific. Perhaps your ledger might show if you have any of the last shipment remaining, or if, perhaps, some other scholar has recently exhausted your stock." The old man's gaze remained fixed upon the gold coin. With a slow, trembling hand, he reached out and covered it. "I had 3 boxes of the Brazilian wax," he muttered, turning to his ledger and running a stained finger down the column of copperplate writing. "It came in on the Santa Maria in September, but it is all gone. Every ounce of it was purchased 3 weeks ago." "Ah," Holmes murmured, leaning forward, his eyes bright with a sudden, intense focus. "A bulk purchase? That is indeed unfortunate for me. Might I ask the name of the gentleman who has monopolized your stock? It is possible he might be induced to part with a small portion." The dry salter squinted at the ledger. "The entry is here. Bought by Mr. Victor Lynch, of Wapping High Street, paid in cash and delivered to his laboratory by our own cart." "Perfect," Holmes whispered, turning to me with a look of quiet triumph. "You see, Watson, the thread is unbroken. The modern ledger does not lie. Thank you, Mr. Crabbe. You have been most helpful." With a swift, decisive movement, Holmes turned and strode out of the shop, leaving the old dry salter staring after us in mild bewilderment. Once more in the cab, Holmes's demeanour changed. The easygoing collector had vanished. In his place was the cold, calculating huntsman who had sighted his quarry. "We have the first link, Watson," he said, his fingers drumming a rapid tattoo upon his knee. Lynch purchased the South American wax. He used it to formulate the seal of the false act. But we must have more than the purchase of the material. We must have the physical proof that connects the wax in his laboratory to the wax upon the document. We must enter his sanctum, and we must do so before he suspects that the Crown has raised its hand. "And what is your plan?" I asked, a feeling of nervous anticipation rising within me. Lynch is a man of intellect. He will not be easily deceived. "He is a proud man, Watson," Holmes replied, "and pride is the great chink in the armour of the intellect. He believes his forgery is perfect. He has deceived the experts of the British Museum. He will not expect a simple country gentleman and his physician to see through his handiwork. We shall play upon his vanity." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small flat parcel wrapped in tissue paper. He unfolded it to reveal a small fragment of ancient blackened parchment, to which was attached a cracked and crumbling seal of green wax. "This," Holmes said, "is a genuine but entirely worthless fragment of a 17th-century deed of release, which I acquired some years ago during my researches into the early English land tenures. The seal is badly damaged. We shall present ourselves to Mr. Lynch as wealthy bibliophiles who desire his incomparable skill to restore this family relic. While he examines the parchment, we shall examine him and his laboratory." The hansom had now reached the lower docks, a place of dismal warehouses, towering masts that loomed like gallows through the fog, and the heavy black water of the Thames lapping against the stone piers. The cab stopped before a narrow 3-storey brick house that stood squeezed between two vast grain stores. A small brass plate beside the door bore the name Victor Lynch, Paleographical Conservator. The building was silent, but a thin curl of yellow smoke rose from the chimney, and through the grimy panes of the first-floor window we could see the dull greenish glow of a gas burner. Holmes pulled the bell wire. The sound echoed hollowly within. After a short delay, the door was opened by a tall, thin man of about 40, clad in a loose velvet dressing-gown that was stained with chemicals. His face was remarkable, highly intellectual, with a high, domed forehead, deep-set dark eyes that possessed a singular, piercing intensity, and a thin, sensitive mouth. It was the face of a fanatic, of a man who lived entirely in the world of the past, yet there was a tension in his brow and a quick defensive movement of his hands that spoke of a mind constantly on its guard. "Yes?" he said, his voice cold and cultured. "What is your business? I do not receive visitors without an appointment." "My apologies, Mr. Lynch," Holmes said, bowing with an air of polite humility. "My name is John Clayton, and this is my friend, Dr. Watson. We have travelled from Sussex this morning in the hope of consulting the one man in England whose reputation in the restoration of ancient documents is absolute." Lynch's eyes scanned us with a quick, diagnostic gaze. He noted my professional coat, Holmes's slightly eccentric country gentleman attire, and the small parcel in my companion's hand. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. "I am very busy, Mr. Clayton," he said, though his voice had lost some of its initial sharpness. My work for the libraries of the state leaves me little leisure. I am prepared to pay 50 guineas for an hour of your time, Holmes said quietly. The document is of the utmost importance to my family's history, and I would trust no other hand to touch it. The mention of the fee, or perhaps the appeal to his professional supremacy, decided him. He stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. "Come up, then," he said, "but I must ask you to be brief." He led us up a narrow, creaking staircase to a large room on the first floor. It was a strange hybrid of a scholar's library and a chemical laboratory. 3 walls were lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound folios, ancient manuscripts, and rolls of vellum. The 4th wall was occupied by a long workbench cluttered with glass retorts, spirit lamps, jars of chemical reagents, and several small iron pots containing melted wax of various hues. The air of the room was heavy and close, smelling of stale tobacco, vinegar, and the sweet, cloying odour of heated beeswax. In the centre of the workbench, sitting under a glass bell jar, was an iron press of ancient design, the very instrument, no doubt, used to stamp the great seals of state. "Now," Lynch said, standing by the hearth and folding his arms, "let me see this document which you value so highly." Holmes carefully unwrapped his tissue-paper parcel and laid the fragment of the 17th-century deed upon the central table. "The parchment is sound, has suffered terribly from dampness and neglect. It is the seal of my ancestor Sir William Clayton, and I am anxious to have it restored to its original state." Lynch stepped forward, his analytical eye instantly focusing upon the parchment. He drew a small lens from his pocket and bent over the table, his fingers moving with a delicate, practised touch. As he did so, Holmes stepped back toward the workbench, his eyes scanning the array of chemical apparatus with a rapid, all-seeing gaze. I watched him closely, my heart beating with a sudden, anxious rhythm. "This is a simple matter of rehydration," Lynch said, his back turned to us as he studied the document. "The wax is a standard medieval mixture of tallow and rosin. It can be consolidated with a warm needle and a solution of dammer. It is not a difficult task, though it requires a certain delicacy of touch." "I am delighted to hear it," Holmes said, his voice sounding entirely relaxed, though his hand had drifted toward a small, white porcelain dish that sat near one of the heating pots on the workbench. In the dish lay several small dark red shavings of raw wax, alongside a small bone spatula. "I see you have some beautiful red wax here," Holmes continued, pointing to the pot. "For your work on the Tudor manuscripts, no doubt? The colour is remarkably rich, almost like the Great Seal of the Act of 1584, which I believe has recently been discovered in Yorkshire." Lynch froze. For a fraction of a second his body was utterly rigid. He did not turn around immediately, but when he did, his face was pale, and his dark eyes burned with a sudden, dangerous intensity. "I do not discuss my private commissions, Mr. Clayton," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. "My work for Baron Maudslay is confidential." "Of course, Holmes said with a reassuring wave of his hand. "I meant no indiscretion. It is only that, as a fellow enthusiast, I am fascinated by the materials of our ancestors. The beeswax of the Tudor period is so different from our modern adulterated products, is it not? So much purer, so much more stable." He reached out, his fingers hovering over the porcelain dish. "This raw material here, for instance. It has a very peculiar crystalline appearance on the fractured edges. I should almost say it was of foreign origin, Perhaps South American? Lynch took a sudden step forward, his hand clenched at his side, his face distorted by a mixture of rage and sudden, cold fear. "You are impertinent, sir. I did not invite you into my laboratory to critique my materials. My wax is of the finest quality, and its origin is no concern of yours." "On the contrary, Mr. Lynch," Holmes said, his voice suddenly losing its rustic tone and hardening to a cold, steel-like clarity. "It is the concern of the entire realm." With a movement of incredible speed, Holmes's hand swept down. His fingers did not touch the wax in the dish. Instead, they closed upon a small crumpled piece of blue paper that lay half-hidden beneath the porcelain basin. The original receipt from Silas Crabb's shop, bearing Lynch's name and the specific designation of the South American wax. "What is the meaning of this?" Lynch cried, springing forward to reclaim the paper. But Holmes was too quick. He stepped back, slipping the receipt into his waistcoat pocket, while his left hand came up to hold the furious paleographer at bay. "The meaning, Mr. Lynch," Holmes said, his grey eyes shining with a terrible intellectual triumph, "is that the modern world has caught up with your Elizabethan fantasy. This receipt, together with the microcrystalline structure of the wax upon the Maudslay seal, completes the chain of physical evidence. You are a very clever man, but you did not know that the wild bees of the Orinoco carry a chemical signature that 300 years of history cannot erase." For a long moment the room was utterly silent, save for the heavy breathing of the three men. Lynch stood before us, his chest heaving, his eyes darting from Holmes to the door, like a wild animal seeking an avenue of escape. The mask of the scholar had fallen away, revealing the desperate cornered criminal beneath. "You have no proof," Lynch whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of hatred and dread. "The British Museum has declared it genuine. They have not seen what I have seen through the lens of my microscope," Holmes replied, his voice calm, rational, and utterly relentless. "They see the form, but I see the truth. Come, Watson, we have the final piece of our puzzle. The Crown Solicitor is waiting, and the air of this room is somewhat too close for my liking." With a polite, ironical bow, Holmes turned and led the way down the narrow stairs, leaving Victor Lynch alone in his laboratory, surrounded by the silent witnesses of his magnificent, ruined deception. As we stepped out into the cold yellow fog of Wapping High Street, Holmes looked up into the murky sky, a deep, satisfied smile playing upon his lips. "The game is won, Watson," he said, his voice soft but ringing with the joy of the intellect. "The ancient barons must yield to the microscope, and the yellow fog of London has one less secret to hide." Chapter 4. The Pollen of Truth. The yellow fog had deepened by mid-afternoon, pressing its greasy, sulphurous face against the windows of our Baker Street sitting-room like a physical manifestation of the moral rot we had uncovered in the depths of Wapping. Inside, the lamps were already lit, casting a warm, amber glow over the leather-bound armchairs and the scientific apparatus that cluttered the corner table. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of coal smoke, wet wool, and the sharp, clean tang of the chemical reagents Holmes had prepared for the final act of our drama. We were not alone. Sitting in the centre of the room, looking like a caged eagle, was Baron Maudslay. He was a tall, aristocratic figure of 60 years, with a predatory nose, cold, watery blue eyes, and a thin, sneering mouth that spoke of centuries of unquestioned privilege. Beside him sat Mr. Alastair Finch, the Crown Solicitor, his nervous fingers drumming incessantly upon his dispatch box. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood by the door, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp, rat-like eyes darting from one face to another with professional vigilance. In the corner, pale, haggard, and guarded by a stout police constable, sat Victor Lynch, his velvet dressing-gown discarded for a respectable but dusty coat, his dark eyes fixed upon the floor in a dull, sullen stare. "This is an outrage, Mr. Holmes," the Baron suddenly burst out, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and aristocratic disdain. He struck his gold-headed cane against the floorboards. "I am a peer of the realm. By what right do you drag me to these rooms and subject my archivist, a scholar of European reputation, to this indignity? The Act of 1584 is a genuine document, validated by the highest authorities in paleography. It restores to my family the lands that were unjustly seized by the Crown. If you think to block my claim with these back-alley theatricals, you will find that the law still respects the ancient rights of the nobility." Holmes, who had been standing by the window with his back to us, his eyes staring out into the yellow gloom of the street, turned slowly. His face was a mask of cold, intellectual calm, but there was a dangerous glitter in his grey eyes. "The law, Baron Maudsley," Holmes said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight of authority, "is a living organism. It evolves to protect the modern state from the dead hand of the past. But my concern is not with the law, it is with the truth. You speak of ancient rights and noble lineage, but the physical world does not recognize these human distinctions. To the microscope, the blood of a baron and the blood of a coal heaver are identical, and the laws of organic chemistry do not yield to the pedigree of the House of Lords." He stepped toward his chemical table, where his brass microscope stood ready under the gas lamp. "You have brought a claim against the Crown based upon a document that purports to have been signed, sealed, and delivered in the 26th year of the reign of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Your experts have examined the vellum, they have tested the ink, and they have declared themselves satisfied. But they have looked only at the surface. They have not descended into that microscopic world where the secrets of the universe are laid bare to the empirical observer." "I have no interest in your scientific jargon, sir," the Baron sneered, though I observed a slight twitch in his left cheek, and his hand tightened upon his cane. "The document speaks for itself." "It does indeed," Holmes replied, "but it speaks in a language you do not understand. Let us examine the seal. The great seal of the Tudor rose, pressed into dark red wax, suspended by a silken cord. To the eye, it is a perfect representation of the Elizabethan signet. But as I demonstrated to Dr. Watson earlier today, the wax itself is of a highly peculiar composition. It is not the pure, unadulterated beeswax of 16th-century England. It is a modern import." "That is a lie!" Lynch cried out from his corner, his voice shrill and desperate. He raised his head, his eyes burning with a wild, fanatic light. "I used only the finest historical materials. The wax was sourced from ancient deposits, melted and purified according to the precise formulas of the Tudor Chancery." "You are a very clever man, Mr. Lynch," Holmes said, turning his cold gaze upon the paleographer. "Your knowledge of the Elizabethan court hand is indeed flawless, and your synthesis of the iron gall ink was a masterclass in chemical deception. But you made one fatal error. You are a scholar of books, but you are not a scholar of nature. You purchased your wax from Silas Crabbe, a dry salter of the commercial road, who imported it from the tropical forests of South America. "And what of it?" the Baron demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "Even if the wax were of modern origin, which we do not admit, it could have been used to repair a damaged seal in later years. It does not invalidate the document itself." "A clever defence, Baron," Holmes remarked, a faint smile playing upon his lips. "But it is a defence that is instantly demolished by the botanical evidence. For the wax does not merely differ in its physical crystallization. It carries within its very substance the absolute, irrefutable proof of its origin, a proof that was sealed into the wax at the moment of its creation in the hive." He turned to the microscope and adjusted the focus with the swift, practised movement of his long, thin fingers. "Watson, be so good as to light the spirit lamp." I quickly struck a match and applied it to the wick of the small lamp beneath the glass retort. Within a few moments, a pale blue flame was licking the bottom of the vessel, which contained a small quantity of a clear, colourless liquid. "This," Holmes explained, "is a highly refined ether solvent. I have taken an infinitesimal fragment of the wax from the seal of the Maudsley document, a fragment so small that its absence cannot be detected by the naked eye. I have dissolved it in this solvent, which has held the lipids of the wax in suspension while allowing the heavier, insoluble particles to settle to the bottom of the tube. These particles I have transferred to a glass slide, which now sits under my lens." He stepped back and waved his hand toward the instrument. "Lestrade, Mr. Finch, I invite you to look through this eyepiece." The Scotland Yard detective stepped forward first, squinting into the brass tube with a look of intense, if somewhat bewildered, concentration. Mr. Finch followed him, his eyes widening as he adjusted his spectacles. "What do you see, gentlemen?" Holmes asked. "I see several small, round objects," Finch said, his voice trembling slightly. "They look like tiny yellow spheres covered in minute spikes, like the seed capsules of some wild plant." "They are indeed seed capsules of a sort," Holmes said, his voice ringing with a sharp intellectual triumph. "They are pollen grains, gentlemen. Specifically, they are the pollen grains of the mimosa and other tropical flora native to the basin of the Orinoco River. But more importantly, they are accompanied by the microscopic skeletal fragments of the bee that gathered them, the Apis mellifera scutellata." "And what is that?" Lestrade asked, looking up from the lens. "It is a species of bee, Inspector," Holmes explained, "that is entirely native to the tropical regions of the southern hemisphere. It was utterly unknown to the naturalists of 16th-century Europe. It did not exist in the England of Queen Elizabeth. No English bee of the year 1584 could possibly have gathered pollen from these South American plants, nor could any Tudor craftsman have formulated a wax containing these microscopic traces." He walked over to the Baron, his figure towering over the seated nobleman. "The botanical truth, Baron Maudsley, is absolute. This wax, which bears the seal of your ancestor, was gathered by South American bees in the 19th century, imported to London by a modern merchant, and used by your accomplice, Mr. Victor Lynch, to forge the document upon which you base your claim to the Yorkshire estates. The ancient feudal nobility has sought to reclaim its grasp upon the modern world, but it has been defeated by a microscopic grain of pollen." A dead silence fell upon the room. The yellow fog outside seemed to press even closer, as if waiting for the resolution of our drama. The Baron's face had turned an ashen grey. His hand shook so violently that his gold-headed cane slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly upon the floorboards. He looked at Lynch, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and silent appeal. But Lynch had broken. The scientific precision of Holmes's demonstration had shattered his academic pride and destroyed any hope of escape. He sank his face into his hands, his shoulders heaving with sudden, silent sobs. "It is true," Lynch whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackle of our hearth. "It is all true. We did it. The Baron promised me £10,000 and a permanent residency at Maudsley Hall if I could produce a document that would satisfy the Treasury. I spent 3 months in his cellars, preparing the vellum, aging the ink, copying the hand of the Elizabethan scribes. I thought I had anticipated every test. I matched the chemical composition of the ink, the weight of the sheepskin, but the wax I did not know. My God, I did not know that the flowers of the Orinoco would speak against me." "That is enough," Lestrade said, stepping forward and laying a heavy hand upon Lynch's shoulder. "Victor Lynch, I arrest you on a charge of conspiracy and forgery of a public document. Baron Maudsley, you will accompany us to Bow Street, where a similar charge will be preferred against you." The Baron did not speak. He rose from his chair with a slow, stiff dignity, his face a hollow mask of ruined pride, and allowed the constable to lead him toward the door. Mr. Alistair Finch followed them, his face beaming with a profound bureaucratic relief, his dispatch-box clutched to his breast like a trophy of war. "Mr. Holmes," Finch said, pausing at the threshold and bowing deeply, "the Treasury is forever in your debt. You have saved the Crown from a monstrous imposition, and you have preserved the integrity of our land laws. I shall ensure that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is fully informed of your incomparable services." "The appreciation of the state is always gratifying, Mr. Finch," Holmes replied, with a polite but distant bow. "But my reward lies in the solution of the problem itself. The truth is its own compensation." When the door had finally closed behind them, and the heavy tread of their footsteps had died away down our stairs, Holmes turned back to the room. The tension had vanished from his frame, replaced by that quiet, meditative calm that always followed the successful application of his analytical methods. He walked to the corner, took his violin from its case, and began to tune the strings, the clear, sweet notes cutting through the heavy, chemical-laden air of our chamber. "A satisfactory conclusion, Watson," he said, looking over the instrument at me with a quiet smile. "The yellow fog may cover our city, and the moral rot of greed may fester in our ancient families, but the laws of nature remain pure, elegant, and absolute. There is a singular beauty in organic chemistry, Watson. It is a world of perfect order, where even the smallest pollen grain must bear witness to the truth." He brought the violin to his shoulder, and a moment later the exquisite melancholic strains of a Mendelssohn nocturne rose into the quiet room, floating out through the fog-rimmed window panes into the dark, listening streets of London. Thank you for watching. Before you go, don't forget to check out our Patreon.